Good evening and welcome to this evening's Lent Lecture. Imagine the time when we could go to a restaurant. At the end of the meal, out comes the sweet trolley. After 5 excellent lectures this Lent, imaginatively organised by Reverend Gemma, giving us much to chew on in the way of main courses, this is the sweet trolley. I'm the waiter who points out what's available. I don't say much about the ingredients or how the sweets were made. I simply offer them to you for your pleasure in a feast of delights. This is not a comprehensive survey of English stained glass, just some of the windows I like and I hope that you will too. They were all designed for churches, which is the predominant location for stained glass in England. And I'm looking only at post-Reformation glass. I found that I couldn't do justice to the wealth of pre-Reformation and medieval and ancient glass in the time available. Some windows I describe are huge and difficult to take in, and I've tried to explain what interests me with close-ups. But sometimes I hope simply to give an idea of the impact of the window as a whole, particularly its design and colour. Don't worry if I move on too quickly for you. There's always something else intriguing to come. And of course, the benefit of recorded lectures is that you can use the pause button if you want to. Well, also you can use the fast forward button, but it's under your own control. That's part 1, A Feast of Delights. But as we're in Holy Week, part 2 is a short reflection on varying treatments of the Crucifixion. Thank you for watching this lecture. There will be an opportunity to discuss it or to ask me any questions via Zoom at 9 o'clock this evening, today the 30th of March. The link for that Zoom is in last weekend's mailing and it's available on the website. So let's start behind a farmyard in Kent at a place called Chudley. Here's what the church looks like, not terribly exciting, and we go in through the south door and immediately turn to our right to look towards the altar. And above the altar we see this window. It's a memorial to Sarah Davigdor Goldsmith, who died aged 21 in a sailing incident. It's designed by Marc Chagall, and it was installed a year or so after her death in 1967. She appears in the window several times, including climbing up a ladder to Jesus on the cross. Note the overall blueness and the flashes of bright colour. Here is Sarah, dead in the water, and on the side a mourning figure, mourning for her. Here she is on her horse, which Chagall said was intended to illustrate pure happiness. And here is the extraordinary depiction of Christ on the cross, with an angel on the left and an unidentified character on the crossbeam, apparently whispering into his ear. At the dedication of this window, Chagall, looking around the church, said, "I could do the rest if you like." And they did like, and so he did make windows for the whole of the rest of the church. In the north aisle, there is a series of small but deep blue windows, picking up the blue from the east window. These are based principally on Psalm 8, but also have reference to creation. Here are 3 lancets. And also one of the windows, slightly larger, that he made for the chancel, with an angel, and you may be able to pick out the word Vava, which was Chagall's name for his wife, All the other windows were completed by 1974, but some of the installation was delayed until 1985 by arguments about the replacement of some existing Victorian stained glass, which until then no one seemed to have thought about. Chagall had died by 1985, and so he never saw the whole church completed, though no doubt he had in his mind's eye. But for us who can simply go and look around us, it's a real treat. And actually there's one more element of that treat which is still in store for us as we turn to leave the church and we see two large windows in the south wall. Here they are, and they're yellow and orange and red with strange creatures and strange designs on them. But they flood the church with light even on a dark winter's day and provide an extraordinary contrast to the other windows. Chagall designed these windows, but he didn't make them. His stained glass was all made by a long-term collaborator called Charles Mark. And so it was with our next artist, John Piper, most of whose designs were made by Patrick Rentians. And here is his well-known baptistry window in Coventry Cathedral. From a distance, it looks just like a lot of different coloured glass, but actually every one of the panels, all 200 of them, were specifically designed, and on the right you can see 3 of those designs, seeing how intricate that design is and how, without looking very closely at each individual panel, there's no sense of that at all, especially in a long shot such as the photo that I've got here. But not all of Piper's glass was monumental in this way, and so I thought I'd show you 2 smaller windows, one in Nettlebed near Henley and one at Lamberhurst in Kent. At Nettlebed in 1970, the east window is based around a tree of life, a motif which Piper used a number of times in his stained glass. And you can see in the centre of the window, the tree has 7 fruit, 7 being the biblical number for completeness. And on the left there are fish, and on the right butterflies, all symbols and signs of life. These bold background colours to each of the 3 lights make it a striking and attractive window. The Lamberhurst window was installed later in 1985 when Piper was already 82 years old. It was made not by Patrick Rentians but by David Wasley. It shows the angel disguised in many people's eyes as a spaceman announcing Jesus' birth to the shepherds. Overall, it strikes me as rather a jolly window. For both Chagall and John Piper, stained glass was a small part of their output, and most of it produced later in their careers. Most of the other windows and artists that we'll be looking at were by artists working exclusively in stained glass. First, Tom Denny, who is still active, producing distinctive windows of dramatic impact. And they have intricate and intriguing details. So here are 2 windows in Chuuksbury Abbey. They're on the theme of Laborare est orare, which is the Benedictine motto meaning work is prayer. And interestingly enough, that same motto, as we'll see later, appears in one of the windows in St James Finch. Note the similarities with those south windows in Tudley Church by Chagall, but also the differences. There's a very strong sense of upward thrust not simply in the colouring of Denny's window, but in his use of the lead lines, the lead which holds the different pieces of glass together. And then, if you look closely, as in this detail from the bottom part of the right-hand window, you'll see small figures. They're all important. They all tell part of the story. In the middle light, there's a green man figure who looks up, apparently based on Psalm 8 again, looks up to the angels right at the top of the window, which we can't see. On the left, there are men working to build a house of prayer based on Isaiah 56. And on the right, working the land, planting a tree, reflecting Haggai's prophecy in chapter 2, verse 4. And then in contrast, here is a much smaller panel and much closer to home too. This is in the porch of East Hampstead Church. And it shows a local event, or a reputed local event, of King Cynegils being baptised by our local saint, Saint Byrne, in 635 AD at a spring apparently not far from the current church there. It's unusual, as Chagall was able to at Chudley, for a single artist to have control over all the windows in a church. As we move back in time to the period after World War II, though, we come to a period when a lot of churches had to be rebuilt, especially in London. And we come to our next artist, who was John Hayward. He not only had the opportunity to provide all the windows, but all the furnishings as well in this church of St Mary le Bow in Cheapside in the City of London. The windows, or two of the windows at the east end, show the Virgin Mary holding the rebuilt church and St Paul, and both of them have a backdrop of City of London towers and spires, many of which were built originally after the Great Fire of London by Christopher Wren. Facing them at the back of the church are two very striking windows with their deep, bright red colour, which describe the work of the City of London Corporation. And then I want to show you two larger windows of Hayward's. The first is his east window for St Peter's College in Oxford, with scenes from the life of Peter surrounding the central figure. Note here the use of blocks of contrasting colour. I show also two nighttime scenes from the bottom of the window. On the left, the denial, and see the three hands of the accusers pointing at Peter, and his hands placed downwards as though he knows absolutely nothing about what they're talking about. And in the background, Jesus looking over his shoulder, hearing Peter's denial. And then on the right-hand side, Peter in prison, as reported in Acts chapter 10. There you can see, just about behind the strong bars, Peter himself. On the right, an angel, and at the bottom, the sentry. The second window is the west window of Sherborne Abbey in Dorset. And like some of Chagall's for Chudley, it was controversial because there was a Victorian window in that window opening. And in fact, the Victorian Society took the vicar and church wardens of the abbey to the top ecclesiastical court, the Court of Arches, seeking to have their plans for the abbey, for that window, rejected the Court of Arches ruled in the churchwarden and vicar's favour, so the window was put in. The window itself is dominated by the figure of Mary, but all the details in the window relate to Christ, who is seated on her lap as a child. They're placed among the lower branches of a tree which extends upwards through the cross to the great green canopy in the tracery lights. The bright sun, symbolising God the Father, breaks through the leaves. On the left, 3 wise men follow the star. On the right, the shepherds and the angel herald are shown, really quite different from Piper's angel. As with many of Hayward's windows, there are lots of other intricate and clever references and allusions, including in this one to the Hale-Bopp comet of the year 1997 when the window was installed, and also a small vignette portraying the Court of Arches with the initials of those involved in the case. At the same time Hayward's career was getting underway, Christopher Webb was at the height of his popularity and about to provide all the windows for another Wren church, destroyed during the war and rebuilt afterwards, St Lawrence Jury, also in the City of London. But before that, he took part in a public competition to replace the memorial window above Shakespeare's memorial in Southwark Cathedral, also lost during the war. He won with the design for this window, which transfers the traditional idea of a tree of Jesse showing the ancestors of Christ into a window full of Shakespearean characters presided over by Prospero. At the bottom are also the 7 ages of man from As You Like It. It's full of joy and delicate treatment, with the villains villainous and the nicer characters charming. And here are some of them, including at the bottom the first 2 scenes from the life of a man. There are 2 Webb windows in St James's, Finchamstead. The Transfiguration east window, and this one by the main door. It's an ascension transported to the closing days of World War II with a group of characteristic people looking up. Like Denny's window at Chuuksbury, the motto at the bottom is Laborare est orari, here reflecting the life of Ethel Caulfield, the rector's widow, who the window commemorates. When Webb decided to become a stained glass artist in the years before World War I, a reaction to the mass production techniques of the large Victorian stained glass firms had set in. And this reaction was led by a man named Christopher Wall. He wanted artists to understand the techniques that they were using for their stained glass and to be able to actually make the glass and paint it themselves rather than relying on someone else to do it. So he was well within the growing arts and crafts movement. And here from 1903 is part of a huge window in Canterbury Cathedral. It's the upper tier of 3 showing the resurrection with an angel kneeling to the risen Christ. The colours and design are just gorgeous. And here is his east window for Leicester Cathedral of 1920, split into 2 sections. The upper part shows Christ in majesty with angels and with its extremely bright white, gold and pinky red colours. The lower part, on the other hand, which is the deposition of Jesus' body from the cross, is set at night and is unusual in its sombre brown tones, as befits the subject. But the contrast between the upper and lower sections of the window is extreme and unusual in itself. And finally, here are 3 small windows by Christopher Wall at Holy Trinity, Bracknell. St Martin and St George, which is a Boer War memorial placed in 1900. Christ and the Children 6 years later, and this small cameo of St Theodore of 1919. An artist strongly influenced by Wall's ideas and using similar techniques but in designs taken to a further level of intense colour was the Scot Douglas Strawn. He was first commissioned to make this window at Winchelsea in East Sussex to commemorate the tragic loss of the Rye Harbour lifeboat and its 17 crew in 1927. The window was installed 2 years later. The form of the window has sea-related scenes of St Nicholas and St Augustine flanking Jesus stilling the storm. But look at the unstilled storm scene at the bottom of the window, and the way the design, especially the lead lines, makes the sea rage. And you may be able to pick out in the central panel the lifeboat close to being overwhelmed, and in the left-hand panel on the left-hand side the stricken boat that they'd gone out to help. It's perhaps unsurprising that Strawn was then commissioned to fill all the other windows that were vacant of stained glass in the church within the next 4 years. On the left, it's another sea-related window with the monsters of the deep being kept in check by angels. And look at the contrast between the deep blues and purples of the sea and the sky and the golden angels themselves who are rooted to the spot. Then on the right, clearly inspired by passages from Revelation, is a very large window. Again, with blocks of colour and striking contrasts. It would be possible to spend a long time on this window unpicking the imagery, but I just wanted to give you an impression of it. We move back a little further in time to the Victorians. There's more Victorian glass in English churches than from any other age. Some of it is very fine, but much is somewhat run-of-the-mill, if not worse. Especially towards the end of the 19th century, when production techniques were being enhanced. In other words, everything was made efficient, but the resulting product was somewhat bland and lifeless. There are 5 Hardman windows in St James, and I would say that they come into the general category of run-of-the-mill. They were put in between 1895 and 1900. But I did want to show you some windows by John Hardman and Co. from somewhat earlier, before the shine had gone off their individuality. The first is the east window at Shottesbrook Church near White Waltham, and I've shown you a picture of the church here. You can see the east window, you can see how large it is, and you can also see that it comes down very low, almost inside the church to floor level. And here's the window itself. It's the Ascension, and the 12 disciples are all there. They're all very clearly delineated and given different attitudes and gestures. But perhaps the glory of the window is in the tracery lights. Those are the lights at the top of the window which show the heavenly choir welcoming Jesus. The window openings in the tracery are always a little strange, and here they are very extreme. And as well as showing the whole angel choir, I've shown you an example of one of the angels and how well they fit into that unusual opening. The second window is at St Paul, Wokingham. Shottesbrook was from 1863. This window in St Paul's was only a year later. They're somewhat different in style, but this is a transfiguration at the east window of the church, and you can see that Jesus's clothing shines with brightness, and that the whole of the window is intricately and carefully and cunningly coloured and designed. St Paul's is an interesting church from the point of view of stained glass, because all the windows were put in when the church was built, and almost all of them relate to the life of St Paul. And so if you want to get an idea of what a church where the glass is designed to go in the church, you only have to go over there, and you have fun spotting what incidents in Paul's life are portrayed, especially in the lower down windows in the nave aisles. But I want to pass now to two Victorian stained glass artists who were never really comfortable with large firms. One was Henry Holliday. And we go back to Southwark Cathedral to have a look at the west window there, which he designed and had made in 1893. It combines the Genesis account of creation with elements of the prayer book canticle, Benedicite omnia opera, O ye works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord, in what I think is a tour de force. And so here's a close-up of the first 3 days of creation above and parts of the created order blessing the Lord, night and day, winds and so forth. And take a look at the far left-hand figure of day in orange, as Holliday seems to have picked up some of the style for that figure from our next artist that we'll come to in a moment. But here are the second 3 days, and all of them, including the lettering and the scenes below, more illustrations of the canticle, strike me as imaginative and lovely. But perhaps the preeminent stained glass artist of the Victorian period, and indeed one of the most popular artists in any format, was Edward Burne-Jones. His mature style took some time to develop. Here is one of his earliest designs, 1847, of the Good Shepherd for a Congregational Church in Maidstone in Kent. It has clean lines and beautiful deep colours. And also here you can see a panel from his large frieze-wide window in Christ Church Cathedral in Oxford of 2 years later, 1849. His Pre-Raphaelite style really developed once he joined William Morris and Company, which was founded in 1851. And to begin with, Morris and Burne-Jones worked with other artists, Rossetti, Ford Madox Ford, Philip Webb. They worked together collaboratively in some churches, but ultimately Burne-Jones became the principal window designer for William Morris and Company. So when Philip Webb built his new church at Brampton in Cumbria, Burne-Jones designed all the windows. This is the east window, centred around the pelican in its piety, a powerful image of Jesus' sacrifice for sinners. This was installed in 1878, and you can see on the right a close-up of the pelican panel, and beyond that Burne-Jones's cartoon, which was coloured and not in the same colours as this panel later on. In fact, Burne-Jones did most of his cartoons in monochrome, and it was Morris generally who decided on the colours and indeed the way in which the draperies were filled in. And it's remarkable how different two treatments based on the same cartoons can look. Here on the left is Faith, Hope and Charity from Christ Church in Oxford. That was installed in 1871 and the cartoons were reused in 1885 in Brampton. It's just remarkable how different they look. Partly it's the colours, partly it's the drapery, but partly it's the way in which the lead lines are used very effectively and creatively in the later window. But one design that was never repeated because of the idiosyncrasy of the window openings was this one, the east window at East Hampstead, which shows the Last Judgment, installed in 1876, and the details show St. Michael and angels scrutinising the Book of Life. East Hampstead has a wonderful selection of Victorian glass, and although it's very diverse, it's well worth a visit. We move back in time 100 years to what is often considered the dark ages of stained glass. The traditional making of glass had disappeared during the onslaught of Puritan iconoclasm during the later Reformation and the Commonwealth years. And stained glass techniques changed and were replaced by enamelling on glass, painting on glass, which was quite different from the way in which, both before and after, most stained glass windows were made. Some of the most successful glass windows of that period were made by two brothers, Dutch originally, the Van Lingers. Abraham Van Linger, I'm going to show you some of his works, was in this country from about 1620 to around 1642. Here is a window in University College Chapel in Oxford, dated 1641, showing the story of Jonah. Towards the top of the window and in the first of the close-ups, you can see him being thrown from the storm-tossed boat into the sea, swallowed by the whale, and then lower down, thrown up onto the land after 3 days. Such windows were often not entirely original in their design and execution. And in this case, we know where the design came from originally. Came from an engraving that had been done getting on for 100 years earlier. Of course, the shape of the engraving meant that it couldn't simply be transferred onto the window, so it had to be redesigned. And on the right, a very rare survival is what is taken to be Van Linger's initial design for transferring from the engraving onto the window itself. Elsewhere in the chapel, there's what I think is rather a crude portrayal of Jesus, also by Van Linger, Jesus at the home of Mary and Martha. And Martha's outrage and her threatening gesture with her kitchen implement is too good not to show you. And now, to round off this feast of delights, let's go back to the beginning, to Marc Chagall. Apart from the windows at Tudley, there is only one other window of his in the UK. It's this one at Chichester Cathedral, installed in 1977. I find it the happiest of all the windows that we've looked at today. Seen from a distance, the red dominates, but close to, we can see all the bright colours that Chagall used. The window's based on the last psalm, Psalm 150. Oh, praise God in his holiness. Praise him according to his excellent greatness. The psalm itself is nothing other than exuberant and delighted joy in praising God. And so I think is this window. In the close-ups we can see King David, the traditional composer of the Psalms, riding on a donkey and playing his harp. Everywhere in the window figures praise God in various ways. Here we can see angels holding the menorah, the 7-branched candlestick from the temple, playing the violin and clarinet. And reminders from these animal heads which Chagall loved, that the psalm ends, "Let everything that hath breath praise the Lord." And so on that joyful and triumphant note, we leave our Feast of Delights, and we now turn to part 2, which is a reflection on the crucifixion. There are more windows in English churches depicting the crucifixion than any other subject. We're only going to look at 4 of them, and all of them come from Oxford and the surrounding area. As background, it's worth remembering that the Gospels give us 4 separate accounts of the crucifixion, but as we look at these windows, we'll consider which part of which Gospel we think they might be illustrating. You, of course, may have quite different ideas from mine, which is the benefit of being able to share the visual aspects of stained glass. Each one of us probably sees something different. So we're starting in Worcester College Chapel, an east window by Henry Holiday of 1865. The composition of the window is reminiscent of the carved figures of the crucifixion which would have stood above the rood screen, the chancel screen, in pretty much all medieval churches. Christ on the cross with his mother Mary and the beloved disciple John. It's only in John's Gospel that we hear of Mary and John, along with Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Clopas, being at the crucifixion. This depiction makes no attempt at realism. In spite of his recent beatings and torture, Jesus' body is unmarked. His pain and suffering is hinted at only by the blood-red streaks of the darkened sky reflected in the crescent moon. The portrayal is of serenity, even as his life ebbs away. His eyes are half shut, but his head is inclined towards his mother, who is looking at John, who is looking back at Jesus. The message of the window is that of John's Gospel. Even at this time of crisis, with death approaching, Jesus remains in control to such an extent that his concern is exclusively for his mother and friend, not for himself. There are allusions in the window to the death that is shortly to come, the skull at the foot of the cross, the sun blotted out. But in the end, the tension between the calm of the window and the brutality of any real crucifixion is for us as viewers to resolve. This is the east window in St Mary, Bucklebury, by Sir Frank Brangwyn, installed in 1912. This window could hardly be more different from the previous one. The crucifixion scene is crowded. Luke refers to a great multitude following Jesus out of Jerusalem to the place of execution. Jesus is hemmed in by the criminals being crucified either side of him. Mary and John are there in the bottom corners of the window, too far from Jesus for any possibility of intimate dialogue. In the sky, the darkness is conjured up with great drama. The sun and moon are almost obscured, but the clouds seem to be erupting with fiery flashes. Once again, the body of Jesus appears unharmed, though the deep red background may allude to what he has already gone through and of his continued suffering. But the most striking thing about the window is the precise way in which Jesus is portrayed, both his posture and the way he is spotlit against the unremittingly sombre background. And by using a similar, albeit more subdued, highlighting technique for Mary and John, Brangwyn retains the connection between these three figures, distant though they remain from one another. But what is it that he is seeking to portray in the unusual pose of Jesus? The rigidity of the body seeming to defy the idea of hanging on the cross, the suggestion of an arched back, and the upturned head. What do they mean? The sponge held up on a reed by a bystander perhaps offers a clue, locating this moment in Mark's account immediately before Jesus shouts out and dies. So Mary and John keep their heads bowed in prayer, and the onlookers retain their blank expressions. As most of them stare out of the window at us, they seem to be demanding our response, and to remind us of the horror of crucifixion, even if we don't see it in Christ's own body. There, in profile, are the tortured bodies of the two criminals. Now we return to University College Chapel, to its east window, made by Michael Connor and Sons and installed in 1864. Once again, as at Worcester College, the Crucifixion is a stylised interpretation of the intimate conversation between Jesus, Mary and John, this time supplemented by Mary Magdalene at Jesus' feet. Here there is eye contact between Jesus and his mother, and John has his eyes closed. As in the two other windows, Jesus' body is unmarked, but blood flows copiously from the wounds made by the nails in his hands, and is picked up in the red and pink drops of the border. The cross stands against a background of dense green foliage, reminding believers of the tree of life. It seems, and in most respects is, a typical, rather uninspired Victorian crucifixion. But this is actually the centre light of a 5-light window. On the left, Jesus before Pilate, who washes his hands, and Jesus carrying his cross towards the place of execution. The right-hand lights show Jesus' body being placed in the tomb and the resurrection. The window as a whole is carefully constructed around the central light. There is a sense of movement from both sides towards the middle. In addition, the 3 central lights all contain the figures of Mary, John and Mary Magdalene, thereby emphasising their presence at the crucifixion. By contrast, none of them, or any other of Jesus' followers, appear in the outer lights. And yet all this ingenious focus on the crucifixion is subverted, thrown to the winds by the brilliance of the glass in the resurrection light on the far right. The figures of Jesus with his multicoloured banner rising from the tomb, and of the angel ready to pass on the good news, draw the eyes of the viewer all the time towards this final scene. It's as if historically everything points to the crucifixion, but that theologically the resurrection is not only the climax, but the joyous fulfilment of God's plan. And now we move to All Saints North Morton. Look at a window, a panel in the tracery in the south aisle from the mid-14th century. Here we step into another world, and not only in terms of style and technique. Here the savagery of crucifixion is the dominant, the only theme. Here There is no one to share the desperation of the moment. Friendship, repose, civilization, all are stripped away, leaving a man writhing in agony past endurance. Consider the angle of the arms. This is the effect of hanging from the cross for hours until the shoulder joints dislocate. At the same time, the lower body twists to take the weight on the feet, here pinioned by a massive nail. Death must be near. When all strength is gone, the body simply suffocates itself. The background suggests imprisonment, the impossibility of escape. The stonework itself makes an impenetrable wall around this man. Even the ravages of time on the glass with its lost and broken pieces seems to reinforce the desolation. Mark reports Jesus as crying out, my God, why have you abandoned me?" just before he shouts for the last time and dies. In this portrayal, we have surely arrived at the heart of darkness in human terms. Nevertheless, for Christians, it is from this darkness that the light of Christ shines out, with its message of hope for everyone. Unlike Jesus' followers, we do not have to endure in the aftermath of the crucifixion their grief and hopelessness. We know, as they did not, that Easter is just round the corner. Death defeated and all future history transformed.